Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'll show you how to paint this beach scene. This is a shorter version of the full-length real-time tutorial available over on my Patreon, which also goes through the sketching process. The full length is just over an hour long, so if you'd like to sketch and paint along with me, then feel free to check out the tutorial over there. I also have many other real-time tutorials available over on there. When you join as a member, you get instant access to all of the previous month's tutorials as well, so there'll be plenty for you to follow along and practice with. I'll have a link down below where you can check out my Patreon and also browse the available tutorials there. The colors that I've got here are, I have two blues. I'll use ultramarine blue for the top half of the sky, and I'll use a bit more primary blue in the bottom half and also in the water. I also have burnt umber for the sand and also to tone down the blues. I've got black and yellow to mix up the grass colors. I also have a warm red and a warm yellow. You could just replace these two with yellow ochre if you have yellow ochre. If not, you can use these colors instead. The red is also good for toning down your greens. I'll start by blocking in the sky, and you can do this in one of two ways. You can either paint around the clouds, or you can just paint over the clouds and then come back later with more white paint to paint in the white of the clouds. So to make it easier to paint in a smooth transition in the sky, I'm just going to paint over the clouds so I don't have to worry about painting around them. And I'm going to start by mixing ultramarine blue with a little bit of burnt umber. Burnt umber makes the blue a little bit more grey, so it's not as vibrant. I'm mixing up paint that's very creamy, and I'm just going to add a little bit of white into the paint as I transition down. I'm going to try something new here, which is instead of adding more white as I go down the page, I'm going to cover the sky in this dark blue, and then later I will work from the bottom up and meet in the middle and create the transition going from a very light color up into the dark blue. So now I've cleaned off my brush and I've picked up lots of white paint and mixed it with the primary blue. I want it to be more of a cool blue, and I'm bringing it upwards into the dark blue. And you can see here that when it meets the dark blue, because my paint is very creamy on the paper, I can just blend it together like that, and I can just bring my brush all the way up and I can get a smooth transition like this. Then I clean off my brush and I'm going to mix up the color of the water. I'm going to start with ultramarine blue with some burnt umber and also some of the primary blue. Now I don't mind if the water looks a little bit more green. In fact, I actually want it to look a little bit more blue-green in some areas, so I will mix some of the primary blue into the mixture with the burnt umber. And you can paint in a slight transition in the water, so it's a little bit darker towards the horizon line, and then I'm just adding in a little bit more white as I move down. And now I just want to add in some dark waves in the water, so I'm just sweeping in some of the darker blue. And now to mix a bit more of a greenish blue, I've placed some cool yellow on the palette, and I'm just going to mix that into my light blue mixture, and I want to place that towards the bottom of the water, closer to the sand, as the water looks a little bit lighter closer to the viewer. I'm kind of just playing around here with the water. I wanted to make it a little bit more lighter and a little bit more green, so I'm just mixing up some more white into the mixture, and I'm just going to play around until I feel like the water looks a little bit more realistic. Now for the sand on the beach, I'm going to mix burnt umber with some white. The sand is a lot darker than the sand that's closer to us, and it's more brown, whereas the sand closer to us is a little bit more yellow. So I'm just using burnt umber with white. I add in a little bit of a darker strip of brown that's further away, and then I make the sand that's a little bit closer to us a little bit lighter. So now that the sky has completely dried, I'm going to work on the clouds. It's very important that the sky is very thoroughly dried before you do this. I'm switching to a round brush, one that comes to a blunt tip. I'm going to use a dry brush technique here to sweep on the clouds. I'm going to only use white paint for now, so I've just squeezed out some fresh white paint. Make sure it doesn't contaminate with any other colors. And to start, I'm just going to find where the clouds are and just place a lot of white paint onto the paper. So my brush is very dry, there's only a little bit of moisture on it. You can use your fingers to run across the bristles to feel how much moisture there is in the brush. And every time I go to pick up some white paint, I'm just going to lay that towards the center of the clouds. Once you kind of get the hang of dry brushing, you'll start to get a feel for how to use it. So when I first pick up paint, I know there's a lot of white paint on my brush, so I'm going to place that in the most concentrated areas in the center of the clouds. And then once I start to use up the paint on my brush, then my brush will start producing more wispy kind of strokes, and that's when I'll move towards the outer sides of the clouds, the outer edges, and paint on a more wispy kind of look. So you can see I'm just building out the shape of the clouds, starting from the center of them and building outwards. If you're not very confident with using this dry brush technique, you can have a scrap piece of paper on the side and just test out your brush marks on that paper before you place it on your painting. When I'm placing the paint down, I'm being very careful and I'm very conscious of how much pressure I'm applying. You don't want to apply too much pressure and start to pick up the layer that's beneath, so the blue. If you feel like when you lay down the white paint it's not very opaque, the best thing to do is to let it dry completely and come back with a second layer on top instead of trying to lay on more white paint while it's wet, because if it's still wet and you start to reactivate the blue underneath and you just try to lay on more paint, it's going to just muddy even more. So it's best to leave it to dry and then come back with a second layer afterwards. You can even use your fingers to help you smudge out some of the edges or lift off a little bit of the paint if it's a little bit too thick. Anything to help you create that wispy texture. So once I've gone in with the first layer and I've placed in all of the clouds, the ones that I started off with are now dry and I can go back to them and place in a second layer. And I'm just going to concentrate a little bit more white paint in the areas of the clouds where it's a little bit more full. So some areas I want it to look more wispy and a little bit more see-through, especially around the edges of the clouds. But in the centers of them, I want to put on a bit more white paint and make it a bit more opaque. So you should only attempt to do this once that first layer has dried. Now I want to build in a little bit of the shadows underneath, so I'm going to mix just a little bit of burnt umber and blue into the mixture. It's going to be very, very pale because in comparison to the white, anything will look darker than the white. So I'm going to make it a very, very pale grey, and I'm going to just sweep that in underneath the clouds. Now I'm going to block in the sand in the foreground. I'm just using burnt umber mixed with a lot of white, and I'll just block in the whole area. And then to paint in the footprints in the sand, I'm going to try and do it while this layer is still wet. So I'm going to try work as quickly as I can here. So I finished blocking it in, and I'm going to quickly switch to my round brush here, and I'll mix up a slightly darker brown now. So I'm mixing more burnt umber into it, and I'll just loosely drop in where the footprints are in the sand. So you can see the shapes are larger down the bottom, and they grow smaller and smaller into the distance. They don't have to be perfect in any way. I kind of just observe the shape of them, and then I'm going to place in a little bit of the shadow. So currently looks very flat. The footprints don't look like they're sinking into the sand, so we have to build in a bit of a transition. So I want to place the darker part of the footprint on the right because the left side should be receiving more light. I've mixed a little bit more burnt umber into the mixture now just to make it darker, and I'm just dropping in some of the shadows, and you can see as soon as I do that, the footprints start to look like they're sinking into the sand. Now I want to work on the water. I just want to paint in a little bit of the foam. I've switched to a round brush with a pointy tip, and I've just picked up pure white paint, and I'm placing it at the very bottom of the water, and you can just place those into the water as you see fit. So wherever there might be a wave, you want to place a little bit of this white paint in to suggest the foam in the water. I'm going to work on the grass now, and I'm going to start with the base color of a very dark green using a mixture of black and yellow. So when you mix black and yellow, you get green. So on camera, the paint looks a lot more black than it is. It actually is a very dark green, but not completely black. Whenever I paint grass, the technique and approach is always the same. I always start with that dark base color, which is the color of the shadow that I can see in the grass. And the brush I'm using is one that comes to a pointy tip, so I can pull out very thin strokes. I'm going to block in the shape of the grass first. So when I'm blocking in the grass, I'm starting with the center of it and just building my way outwards. And while I'm doing this, I'm also just observing the color of the grass, so they're not all the same shade of green. Some of them are a little bit more of an olive green, more of a warmer yellowish green, and some are more of a cooler bluish green. So I'm just observing that as I'm painting these in, because later when I start to layer on the lighter colors, I want to have a bit of variety in them, and I'll know where I want some of the grass to be more of a yellowish green and where I want some of them to be more of a bluish green. So I've placed some warm yellow on my palette. You can just use yellow ochre if you have that. I'm mixing that into the dark green mixture that we use for the base of the grass, and then the lighter that I want the paint to be, the more yellow I'll add into the mixture, whether it be cool yellow or warm yellow. I've also placed a little bit more ultramarine blue on my palette, which I'm going to use to mix the green as well. Mixing ultramarine blue with either warm yellow or cool yellow will produce more of a muted green as opposed to using primary blue, which is a cool blue. The most muted green you'll get is from using warm blue and warm yellow, and the most vibrant green you'll get is using cool yellow and cool blue. So I always keep that in mind when I'm mixing greens. When I'm going in with the second layer of green, usually the difference in value between that and the base layer is more similar, and the jump between the second layer to the third layer is a lot more obvious. So on camera, it might be hard to see the second layer I'm applying because it looks just as dark as the first, but hopefully from a different angle, you can see that the second layer is more green and just a little bit lighter in value. I also always keep in mind that dark colors will dry lighter, so you'll be surprised at how much lighter this green is once it's dried, even though when you first lay it down, it looks very dark. And now I'm mixing up a lighter green for the third layer. I want it to be more of a bluish green, so I'm mixing a vibrant green using cool yellow and cool blue. And then if I want to tone it down a bit, I can either add in some of that existing muted green mixture I had from the second layer, or I can add in a little bit of red or a little bit of black. I observed that the grass growing on the right side is more of a blue-green, so that's where I'm going to concentrate this. And I'm also going to paint in some of the little patches of grass that's growing, just so it looks a little bit more full and it doesn't just look like 4 patches of individual grass. I want it to look like there's more grass growing all over the sand. Now I'm going to work on the third layer on the patch of grass on the left, and I observe this one is more of a warmish yellowish green, so I'm mixing more red into the mixture and keeping it warmer. You can use a warm blue for this green mixture. I add in a little bit of white to brighten it up, but usually when I mix greens and I want to brighten them, I add yellow instead of white because white makes the colors more pastel. But if that's the green you're going for, then you can add a bit of white into the mixture. And for the patch of grass on the right hand side, I also observe it's a bit more of a blue-green, so I'm going to go back into the blue-green mixture I had from before. And I'm just going to work on highlighting it. I'm going to gradually add in more yellow and more white into the mixture as I start to bring out the brightest highlights. Remember, you don't want to highlight everything, because if you highlight everything, then really nothing is highlighted. So you want to concentrate some of your brightest highlights in the areas that really are receiving more sunlight, so usually concentrated towards the top of the patch of grass or towards the tips of them. And I'm just going to go over all the patches of grass now and start adding on this final layer of highlight. I actually find this is the most fun step because adding the highlights really makes it pop and it looks a lot more realistic and kind of comes to life. But again, be mindful of where you are placing the highlights and don't place them everywhere. So really observe where are the brightest parts and only apply them there. So now that I've finished most of the painting, I just want to go back to work on the sand a little bit. First, I'm going to darken the shadow that's underneath the patch of grass on the right. I'm going to mix up a muted brown color, so using burnt umber and adding in some ultramarine blue. I'm going to drop that shadow in just underneath, since as we observe, the sunlight is coming from the right side, so the shadow is casting onto the left side. In this process, you might cover up some of the grass that you painted, so you can just go back in later after this has dried and just paint in some more. I'm just dropping in some shadows, just so it doesn't look like the grass is just sitting on the sand with no shadows being cast at all. This makes it look a lot more realistic. I'm also going to work on the footprints in the sand a little bit more. I want to deepen some of the footprints and also just add in some more so the sand doesn't look so smooth. So I'm just going to paint in more shapes in between some of the gaps in the sand. Now I'm going to try add a little bit of highlight using white paint. I'm going to place that right next to the darkest parts of the footprint to hopefully elevate that part of the sand and let the footprint sink down. And the last thing I want to do is just paint in a few more grassy strokes in that patch on the right where it got covered up when I was repainting in the shadow. So I'm just going to work on that and just add in some more strokes so it looks a bit more natural.